Hello, hello, hello. The clock struck 12, so we have the honor of beginning. Thank you for finding a window of time to join us while we take part in this experience of growth and insight into Naropa University. As you see behind me, I promise this isn't quite how Naropa's sycamore green looks at the moment, a little bit whiter than today. But today we're going to have a chance to hear from some Naropa leaders, expand our understanding through a sample class, and join a broad array of breakout sessions after this main session. But before we do, let's learn just a little bit more about what it is we're learning and why we are all here today. Because we're here to learn about Naropa. And Naropa was founded in 1974 by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And it was the first accredited university to bring a concept called contemplative education to the West. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, because at Naropa, mindfulness practice is at the center of everything that we do. We truly believe that changing the world starts from within, inside you as an authentic individual. Now, whether you're going for a master's program, your bachelor's, a certificate program, looking to take an individual courses for some transformation, academic life at Naropa is complemented by self-reflection and learning to be mindful. One aspect of contemplative practice that is close to our hearts at Naropa is the Naropa bow. Now, it represents something unique to every community member because the Naropa experience isn't one of being told how contemplative practices are going to work for you. Meditating might achieve different outcomes for you than it might for me. And the experience is all about exploring your interaction with some of these practices. So I'm going to go through my practice of the Naropa bow, and it might mean something very different to you than it might mean to every student here at Naropa. But in general, what the Naropa bow is it's a moment of mindfulness, a chance to take a moment, breathe, maybe transition from one activity to the next, and countless other outcomes. For me, a common practice is focusing on my feelings of being overwhelmed. A few different things stack up on my plate. The Naropa bow really helps me to take a moment and focus on some of these things. So feel free to sit back and observe in front of your camera or take part in the practice with me, anything that you find some value in. But as I start with my Naropa bow, I always close my eyes, take countless deep breaths throughout the practice, and I get a flat base connected back into the earth. Straighten up my spine to get a line back connected to the earth. And mine's a quick 3-step process that I'll elongate a bit for us today. My first step, I focus on my mental state. Explore what thoughts and emotions are going through my head right now. Am I feeling stressed? Am I feeling overwhelmed right now? If so, a moment to explore how I'm feeling about those emotions and where they might be coming from. My second stage is more of a physical check-in. If I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed, is that manifesting anywhere in my body? For me, a lot of times it manifests in my lower back. So I always take a moment to explore those feelings. And then my third and final stage is a real transitionary practice. What I was just doing, how I feel about that wrapping up, and then look forward to the next step in my day, how I can get ready for that and really prepare for that to start. When I feel centered, when I feel ready, a simple bow at the waist. Well, thank you for taking part in that. Maybe your first Naropa bow is complete. Maybe your 100th Naropa bow is complete. Hopefully there will be many more of those in your future. We'll do one more of those towards the end of this session, but we've got a lot in store for us today. In a little bit, we're going to dive into a sample class. But before we do, I want to take a moment just to learn a little bit more about the history of Naropa and why it is that we're here doing what we do. We spoke earlier about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, our founder and leader of yesteryear. But before we embark upon this journey today, let's take a moment just to gain some insight into Naropa and how it came to be. But to do that, we have to take a moment just to learn a little bit more about our founder. Born in Tibet in 1940, Chogyam Trungpa led a group across the Himalayas to India after China entered Tibet. And he was just at the young age of 19. That was 1959. Now, while in India, he taught at a school started by the Dalai Lama before receiving the opportunity to attend Oxford University in England. In the early 1970s, Trungpa began giving seminars and lectures at the University of Colorado, right here at the base of the Rocky Mountains. Now, 1974, that's truly where Naropa's story begins, as Trungpa and his students founded the Naropa Institute. Now, in 1974, that was exclusively a summer program. It was really bringing a lot of those contemplative values to the West for one of the first times. It was expected to draw 200, maybe 300 students, but 1,600 students attended that first summer session of the Naropa Institute. Now, by the mid-1980s, Naropa became a fully accredited institution of higher learning. And we've been on the forefront of contemplative education since. One of those professors making that possible is Dr. Clarissa Cigrand, who we will have the honor of learning from today. But we won't dive just right in. First, we'll learn just a little bit about who we have the honor of learning from today. Dr. Cigrand is an assistant professor and hybrid co-director in the Mindfulness-Based Transpersonal Counseling Program. An educator, researcher, mental health counselor, and clinical supervisor, Dr. Cigrand received her doctorate in Counselor Education and Supervision. Now, she's passionate about the fields of transpersonal counseling, contemplative practice, contemplative pedagogy, social justice, and liberation. Today, Dr. Cigrand's class, Embracing the Shadow and the Light, will find us taking part in Jungian Exploration into Greater Integration and Wholeness. Together, we will review Dr. Carl Jung's work on integrating two aspects of our personality, shadow and light. We'll cover their personal and collective manifestations, why they matter, and how we can live more integrated lives through engaging in some experiential activities. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Cigrand.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. And yeah, it's so great to be with you all today. So over the next 45 minutes, we are going to be covering this presentation. And I was thinking before we get started, it could be nice just to ground in with a contemplative practice. We'll keep it pretty brief today because, again, we do have a lot of information to cover. So if you'd like, you're welcome to join me. But I will begin just by closing my eyes, and you are also welcome to close your eyes or just simply have a soft gaze towards the center of your screen. And we'll begin now just by bringing a little bit of mindful awareness to your spine and just noticing the position of your spine in this moment. I've heard it's helpful to imagine that there's a string attached to the top of your head that's gently supporting an upright and relaxed spine. And we'll begin this practice now by bringing awareness to our breath and noticing what it's like to connect fully with your in-breath and your out-breath. And perhaps connecting with another deep and full breath cycle. And perhaps connecting with yet another breath. And in connecting with breath, knowing for yourself that there's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to be doing, except simply being here, connecting with the vitality of your own breath. And we'll close this practice today just by a simple moment of self-gratitude and self-acknowledgement for taking this time for yourself. And whenever you're ready, you're welcome to open your eyes if they were closed, and we'll continue with this presentation. Okay, that was really helpful for myself. I don't know about y'all, but I will go ahead and share my screen at this point. So I am definitely a visual learner. So I do like to prepare visuals whenever I teach a class. So I did make this PowerPoint for y'all today. And again, today we're going to be talking about this Jungian exploration of embracing the shadow and the light. Some of y'all might be familiar with the shadow. I know for myself, I really loved Tool when I was in high school, and he had this song called 46 and 2, which was all about integrating the shadow. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate that. So yeah, like this idea of embracing the shadow, it's one of these parts of human consciousness that if we recognize the potential that exists within us, it can lead to greater wakefulness, greater freedom, just greater wholeness in integrating all parts of ourselves and all facets of both the personal and collective humanity. And so that's what we're going to be entering into today, and I'm looking forward to getting started. So I always think it's good to talk a little bit about the history of what we're learning. And so I wanted to share just a little bit about Dr. Carl Jung. You will probably hear him repeated in a number of your classes here at Naropa, particularly in the Mindfulness-Based Transpersonal Counseling program. We place a lot of emphasis on him because he is considered to be one of the grandfathers of transpersonal psychology as we know it. So just to say a little bit about Dr. Carl Jung, he was a Swiss psychiatrist. He was originally a student and then a contemporary of Dr. Sigmund Freud, but they ultimately broke away just through a difference in terms of how they understood the personal unconscious. So Dr. Freud just saw the personal unconscious as residing within the individual psyche. And Dr. Carl Jung, he fundamentally believed that we also have to apprehend the collective psyche, that there's a collective awareness, a collective version of self that's also important for us to integrate as we move towards greater levels of self-integration. And so Dr. Carl Jung has brought so many important concepts into Western psychology, and I just want to share a few right now. Individuation is a concept that he spoke about, similar to self-actualization, but it's this idea of owning and integrating all parts of self into experiencing greater wholeness and really being able to differentiate into a distinct personality that's separate and distinct from this kind of greater collection of what I'm taking in terms of my culture, society, and other forms of kind of just taking in interjects or messages from the outside. He also brought this understanding of synchronicity into our psychological framework. And so synchronicity is really this understanding of meaningful coincidences, those times when we have this happenstance occurrence, where we have this inner experience that matches some form of outer experience, and that shared meaning that happens between those two just feels like something really powerful just happened, and I really want to pay attention to what that message contains for myself. A few others that we're going to talk about in this presentation today are archetypes and the collective unconscious, and specifically within that we're going to be looking at shadow and light. And one final one that I did want to share, just because this is pretty common in terms of Western psychology, but Dr. Jung also brought in this idea of extroversion and introversion into mainstream understanding. So truly, he's done so much for our field, and it truly is an honor to get to speak to him today. And so just to share a little bit about the collective unconscious, again, it can be a difficult idea to grasp. The collective unconscious is something that you could consider it to be this repository or storehouse or imprinting of human experience from our ancestors, from those in the past. It can include images, it can include knowledge, concepts that we're essentially inheriting from our ancestors. Some people can even think of it as this like repository of all collective human experience. Some people even liken it to the Akashic records. For those that are interested in shamanism, some people think about it in terms of like another layer or view of reality that we have access to, that again contains everything that we've ever experienced in humankind. So Carl Jung was really dedicated to understanding the collective unconscious, and he spent 6 years of his life really deeply exploring this. He undertook a lot of journaling. He would create mandalas. He would draw figures that would represent the archetypes, the figures of beings, the energetic imprints that he was experiencing when he was exploring the unconscious. And he recorded it all in this book called The Red Book. And maybe some of y'all have heard of it, but it truly is a work of art and a deep kind of deep dive into a part of ourselves that just goes beyond normal everyday waking experience. So certainly something to look into if you're interested in that. So within the collective unconscious, Carl Jung believed that we have archetypes that really comprise the collective unconscious. And so archetypes, you can think of these as these molds or templates that exist in an unmanifested kind of formless way, but then within our collective consciousness, they can take shape. So even thinking about it as like a mold, something that exists in this formless state that can drive through form, and then we can have an experience with it. So I think one way to really understand archetypes is to think about like pantheistic religions. So pantheistic religions, through the number of different gods and goddesses, might embody one form of archetype. So one way of thinking about archetypes is just to think about those kind of collection or storehouses of different ideas. So another example of an archetype could be the hero's journey, that we're encountering this personal hero who's maybe working with some different figures that are on the liminal plane, working with our personal shadow, working with parts of self that we might scapegoat or see as being harmful or devious in some way, working with archetypes such as rebirth and transformational processes. So archetypes are really just these developed elements of the collective unconscious. And while we might not have this idea that archetypes are existence outside of us, when we encounter them in art, literature, and myth, it might evoke a deep feeling within us. We might begin to really feel that there's something true or resonant or something that's deeply embedded within the human psyche that this harkens to. So one example of archetypes or a movie that's really represented archetypal manifestations is Star Wars. So we have Darth Vader, who represents the shadow side, the part of humanity that's really in this kind of over power grab, or this kind of menacing kind of way of being. And then we have Luke Skywalker, who really embodies this hero that's on this hero's journey. He decides to go to the underworld and really work with the power of the Force. The Force can also be seen as this archetype, the part that binds us all together. And then we have figures such as Yoda, who kind of represents the hermit, or the wise sage or the wise elder that's there to teach us things. So this idea of archetypes, again, it can be kind of difficult to understand, but when we're endlessly encountering archetypes in our daily life through art, literature, myths, and even advertisements can really invoke this idea of archetypes. I would say the siren is something that we see in a lot of modern advertisements. So they evoke these deep feelings within our collective psyche that just really stir and bring us to greater levels of self-integration if we choose to see them that way. I probably am not going to be able to get into all these archetypes, but I think this in and of itself could be a really fascinating class. But one example of an archetype that can be really again, really resonant, that strikes a lot in our collective, is this idea of the great mother, this nurturing, creative life force, the thing that, the great mother is something that we can even think of our own mothers, We can think about deities or goddesses that really represent Great Mother. It's something that we can see in a lot of movies and myths as well. One notable example could be in the traditional tarot deck, the Empress, or even in The Wizard of Oz, the Good Witch of the North really embodies that idea of the Great Mother. So while we have these like positive light aspects of archetypes, we also tend to have what's considered to be more of a shadow aspect. And when we're holding shadow aspects of an archetype, these are archetypes that are seen to be destructive, excessive use of power, even subhuman in some kind of way. So there's also a lot of religions or myths that will take on this type of shadow side of the mother. Again, an example with the Wizard of Oz with the Wicked Witch of the West. You can really see that kind of clearly spelled out. One quick thing that I do think is important to say when we're looking at something like the Devouring Mother, this can also be really misunderstood, and I think Kali is a perfect example of that. The Devouring Mother can also take on these qualities of destruction, so cutting away the things that no longer serve, cutting through illusion, and again, I think it's just important to name that while something might take on the shadow quality, there's also parts of self where that can really be empowering or and just important things to really be integrating from within. So again, some other examples that we might see in myth and storytelling is the wise old man. This is a person that's meant to be our guide, our sage. They really embody wisdom and understanding and life experience. And then we also, on the flip side, have that shadow aspect. So this kind of idea of the devouring father. So those who are kind of have this unrestrained desire for supreme power. There's this cruelty or destructiveness that can really typify this archetype. Again, you can see this pretty notably in different types of mythology. And it's also been considered that this idea of the doddering fool, I think Homer Simpson probably best typifies this, is also kind of seen as a shadow aspect of the father archetype. Some other really cool archetypes, again, I wish I could just take this deep dive in with you all, but the rebirth archetype is just something that you see across religion, you see it across initiation and rituals, you see it across even this idea of like reincarnation, even seasons can take on this idea of rebirth, and we have some notable figures in mythology who have really kind of taken on this archetype of rebirth. The idea of rebirth is something that all of us can take on, even if we decide to engage in a simple ritual. The trickster is another really great archetype that can just be really incredible to think about how often the trickster can show up in different mythology or different cultures. And I just wanted to share just a few examples of how the trickster shows up. I know for myself, this idea of unconscious compensation is something that Dr. Jung has developed. And this idea of unconscious compensation is once you start acting big, like your ego starts getting big, you might slip on a sidewalk or you might stumble over your words. So this idea of unconscious compensation is one way that the trickster element kind of is embedded into our waking day. So for this presentation, we're largely going to be focusing on the shadow. But again, I just wanted to demonstrate that the shadow is kind of seen as being one notable archetype amongst many. And for Jung, this idea of moving towards individuation or reaching greater levels of wholeness in self is really about being able to incorporate all these different archetypes into our psyche. And so the shadow archetype, which we're going to be spending the rest of our presentation on, is really looking at these repressed or disowned parts of self. So we've already looked at some forms of shadow archetypes with the devouring mother and the devouring father. But the shadow is something that can be projected onto an individual, onto groups of people. And again, we can find really notable examples of that throughout humanity. Usually when the shadow is created, it's a part of self or a part of a group that's found to be unacceptable in some kind of way. And rather than owning that or seeing it as an aspect of self, it's then projected onto another and thereby disowned. It's a part that maybe we don't want to recognize in ourselves. And so we're just going to see it in another person and feel aversion towards that person or even hatred. And again, in doing so, just not feeling this willingness to look at it within ourselves. So here you can see just a few examples of how the shadow can be projected. Throughout human history, if you're looking at almost any culture, there's been some form of ritualized or collective form of scapegoating. And scapegoating is essentially when you have a projection that you're putting onto someone, and then they become the holder or the vessel of that projection. A scapegoat can be an individual. If anyone here identifies as the black sheep of your family, you have probably experienced projections from your family and are the vessel of those. You also really see this in a societal way. So I'm personally of the belief that any group that is experiencing marginalization or oppression in our society is being scapegoated in some kind of way. Something that's considered to be unacceptable or unwanted is being put onto a group of people. I think a very notable example of that would be in Nazi Germany with people who were Jewish, who were the collective scapegoats for that society. Even in the Old Testament, they had an example of the idea of the scapegoat, where it was this ritual that was practiced where the culture and society, once a year, they would put all of their sins and their transgressions on the head of a goat. And then they would take the goat and they would banish it out into the wilderness. And again, it was a way of kind of absolving a group of people from their transgressions, their wrongdoings, and their sins, putting it onto this symbolized object and then banishing that object. So again, it's something that we do see repeated in human history, and is an important part of human history and personal history to look at, because this idea of scapegoating is that whatever we are putting onto another, we're not really allowing ourselves to own within ourselves. And if we're not owning this within ourselves, we're also living somewhat fragmented lives and also allowing that shadow to have unnecessary power over us. So this idea of being able to recognize our shadow, see it as a potential, see it as something that exists within us, ultimately can help us have that integration experience so that we can just have more executive control or kind of understanding of the potential that it has in our lives. So in talking about the shadow, I'd love to invite us to have some form of personal inquiry at this point. So we'll plan to do an activity together where you are going to pick one person in your life for whom you believe there's some shadow projection happening. But before we get into that, even in your waking life, it can be a really helpful, skillful practice to, with the people that are in your life, just to ask this question: what is this person mirroring for me? Anytime that we feel an aversion towards someone, a dislike for someone, or something that we just otherwise find annoying or unsatisfactory in some kind of way, it can usually indicate that there might be a part of our shadow that we are projecting onto that person. I know for myself, I had a really hard time in classrooms when I was a student with like students that were know-it-alls that just had to have all the answers and were always like speaking their mind. And there was two parts of that shadow for me. The first part was I have a know-it-all type of way of being. Like, there's a part of me that does want to be the expert. There's a part of me that does want to know the answer. And so instead of owning that in myself, it was just so much easier to see that in the other person and feel that aversion. The second part of that projection for me is that sometimes we can project an underexpressed part of self. So something that we're not allowing ourselves to fully express or embody. So for those people in the classroom that would be so quick and forthcoming to speak up and speak their mind, I saw them as being self-centered or taking up too much space. But I was also the type of person that wouldn't take up a lot of space, where I was like relatively quiet in the classroom, or I just didn't know how to value my voice and what I had to offer. And so sometimes when we are projecting shadow, we're also projecting something that's ultimately underexpressed that we're just also not fully owning. So that one example that I gave of seeing others as self-centered, where maybe, again, you're not letting yourself fully embody your gifts or share those gifts with others. I think another really great example is seeing laziness in someone else when you might be a very industrious even over-focused person to some points where you won't even let yourself kind of slow down or rest. That can be another notable example. And then maybe for folks who judge authentic self-expression, when again, it's something that you're denying within yourself. So shadow projection can happen with something that we need to own, or something that we just need to own more fully because we're under-expressing it in some kind of way. One thing that is important to name before we do this experiential is that owning shadow isn't really the same as just accepting people who cause harm to you. That's really not the point of it. The point of it is these qualities that we find aversive in another, just bringing a little bit more inquiry to seeing if this is something that we can more fully integrate into ourselves. And again, there is a lot of potential that exists by taking an experience like this on. So at this point in time, I'm going to invite you all to do an experiential activity. This was something that was created by Ken Wilber, and it's called the 3-2-1 shadow process. If you'd like, you can type on your computer. If you have a notebook and a pen handy, feel free to write on that. Or if you'd simply just like to close your eyes and visualize this process, you're welcome to do that as well. It can be powerful to write things down just so that you're really kind of bringing ideas onto paper. But again, it is completely up to you. So we'll just take a minute to switch gears, go into this experiential activity, and we're going to do what's called the 3-2-1 shadow process. And so we're going to begin this just by thinking of one person for whom it's maybe a little bit difficult to get along with. This could be someone that, again, we just feel some level of aversion towards, someone that it's just kind of easy to have some judgments about this person, someone that might irritate us or disturb us in some kind of way. And so we're going to bring this person to our mind's eye. And for this first step, we are going to imagine this person. So bringing them in our mind's eye, we are going to have a conversation with them. So in your journal or on your computer, or even just in your visual field, just take an opportunity right now to write out those specific judgments that you have about this person. And feel free to use he, she, or they language when describing this person. They are this. She is that. He does this. So at this point, as you're writing these out, just feel free to not censor yourself. This person is not going to be looking at what you're sharing. There's no need to say the exactly right thing. And there's also no need to be nice. So just take some time now just to write out what some of these different judgments are. And we'll spend just about another few moments with that. So the next step in this process, we are going to have an actual dialogue with this person in our imagination or in our mind's eye. So we're going to imagine that we are explicitly speaking to this person, and we're going to use you language this time. So we're just going to be in dialogue with this person. So we're going to talk directly to them as if they're here, and we're going to tell them what bothers us about them. So as we're holding them in our mind's eye, you're more than welcome to ask this person the following questions and imagine what this person might respond back to you when you're asking them these questions. If you'd like, you're welcome to record these in your journal, or just again, just be in your visual field as you're imagining this dialogue with this person. So the very first question that you're welcome to ask: why are you doing this to me? And the second question you're welcome to ask: What do you want from me? What do you want from me? And the third question you're welcome to ask, what are you trying to show me? What are you trying to show me? And the final question, what do you have to teach me? What do you have to teach me? And so leaving that visual field with this person and our dialogue with them, the next step that we're going to do is we are actually going to go back to step 2. And this time we're going to use first person language, and we're going to take on those traits that we used in step 2. So anything that you said about he, she, or they, you're going to take them on with I statements. I am angry. I am jealous. I am judgmental. Or whatever the case is for you. One thing to note when taking on these parts, just notice if you can relate to this experience from the part of self, that recognizes your wholeness. Sometimes it can be easy to kind of fall into the inner critic when we go to this segment. So I really want to invite you, if that feels resonant, to speak and own this from the part of self that's ultimately seeking greater self-integration. And so again, we'll just take a few minutes for you to use those I statements and take on those parts from step 2. And so for our final step 5, we are going to fully notice and just acknowledge these disowned qualities in self. So for this part of the experience, this isn't meant to be conceptual. It's meant to be just being in the experience of what is it like to actually own this quality within yourself. And so nothing to get really abstract about, but just simply be this quality. And this very final step is optional, only if you like to do it or if you feel called to do it. But in this final step, if you'd like to even visualize this person in your mind's eye that you had before, as well as visualize yourself. And just noticing anything that might arise in your visual field, any shifts that might happen for you as you're interacting with this person. Any differences that you might be noticing in how you're relating with this person in your mind's eye. And if you'd like, even just taking a moment to thank this person and thank yourself for engaging in this practice. Okay, right on. So thank you for partaking in that with me. I wish I had time to process that with you all. I would certainly be doing that if I could see you. Thanks, Peter. So let's see, we'll move on to the second half of this presentation, which I think personally is just as important. And for some people, this actually might be the work that you might feel called to do. I know for some of us, it might be so easy to look at the things that we don't like about ourselves or to kind of own shadow. That's something that we might feel really called to do. But just as much as it's important to own our shadow, it's also really important to own our light, the qualities, the potentials that exist within us. that are really worthy to nurture and recognize. So embracing our light is, it's when we're projecting our light onto others, this can happen in so many different instances. Number one, anytime you're putting someone else on a pedestal where they just seem larger than life to you, where they can do no wrong, where it's just so easy to admire this person, to see all their good qualities, that usually is an indication that there's probably some projection of light that's happening. We live in a society where hero worship and celebrity worship is rampant. And so this idea of projection of light is something that it's pretty common within our collective, and it just means that it's something that it could be really worthwhile for us to look at. I think something that maybe folks who are interested in Naropa, I've just encountered this more common than maybe a more kind of like conventional group of students, is that sometimes there can be this tendency to give power away to those that we consider to be spiritual authority, where and this can happen in subtle and not so subtle ways. So I will just say for an example within myself, I had certain teachers in my life who they were just larger than life. They just had an aura about them. They just had this way of being that I just couldn't help but admire. And when I would be in relationship with them, I just felt so diminished. Like, wow, like you're incredible. For some people, this can even mean like giving your power away over to other people. And in doing so, like really, again, like forgetting to relate to what this person is mirroring in your own life, to what you're really seeing, and owning that even as a potential, even as something that's latent within yourself. Again, this idea of like projecting our light, it's when we tend to self-diminish, it's usually an indication that there's some work that we can be doing with that. It can also be really common to project light when we're only seeing this person's persona. So like, let's say a rock star on the stage, we're seeing their charisma, we're seeing their fearlessness, we're seeing the way that they're sharing their gifts in such a full, embodied, like freedom enhanced way. But we're failing to see that this person is also a fully fledged human being that has flaws, that has a persona, that's putting on a show, like in their entertainer selves. And so this can also happen when we're just not seeing this person as a full human being, and kind of projecting like guru status onto others, projecting like hero status onto others. It's just also something that we really need to look at when we're not also willing to see people as full human beings. And I think that can really happen in any type of like teacher mentoring relationships as well. So just something that's important to look at. Okay. And so I've heard some people call this like this idea of like reclaiming our inner gold. Some people call it positive shadow. Some people just call it reclaiming our light. So whichever concept works well for you, like you're welcome to choose. And so for the final part of this activity, we are going to be doing another personal inquiry where we're going to be examining who do I put on a pedestal? Who does seem larger than life to me? Who seems to just be full of light, full of amazingness, where I might not actually be seeing the full person? Or who do I project my light on to the point where I begin to feel somewhat diminished or not good enough, or there's no way I can ever be like this person? Sometimes we can disown like relational skills, someone who's just incredibly warm and friendly, people who, you know, are really great at expressing their emotions, people who have different spiritual propensities, as well as people who have different intellectual capacities. So there's so many ways that we can be projecting our own latent potential onto others. And so for the final activity, this is something that was developed by Douglas LaBier, and we're going to be owning and reclaiming some of that inner gold. So similar to what we did with the shadow projection, you're welcome to write these down or just be in your own visual field as we're doing them. And just take an opportunity also to notice if this is something that's a little bit more difficult for you to do than the shadow projection. And if so, just really good information to have, and it might mean this is something that you can continue to work with. So similar to what we did in this last 1, 2, 3 shadow process, we are going to think of someone. This time it's going to be someone that we either admire or somebody that we envy. So someone for whom they just have that larger than life quality to them. And we're going to pick that person. We're going to hold them in our mind's eye. And then we are going to write down a list of qualities or attributes that we admire or envy about this person. So we'll just take a second to think about some of these different traits that we really appreciate about this person. And we'll spend just another moment or two thinking of some of these different qualities. So for the second half of step 1, we are just going to pick one quality to work with. So from that list that you've created, just think about one quality from within that list that you'd really like to focus on for this experiential. And once you have that decided on, we are going to go back into our visual field and we're going to envision what it would look like if we embodied this quality right now in our lives. So again, if this was an intellectual, an emotional, a spiritual, or relational quality, we're going to visualize in our mind's eye, how would your life look if you were embodying this quality right now? And just allowing whatever impressions come your way. Seeing what you notice in yourself. Noticing any feelings or shifts that are occurring for you as you're embodying this quality. And so for step 3, we're going to go back to our journal or just get a little bit more into our conceptual mind. And we're going to journal or think about what it would be like if we embodied this quality. How would this change our life? How would this shift our relationship to self and others? Would we notice any changes in our career, in our family, in our network of friends, or even just within self? So we'll just take a moment to notice how our life would transform if we reclaimed this inner gold. And just taking a few more moments to reflect on how this would transform your life. And even noticing any newness in sensation, feeling, or thought that comes when we're embodying this quality. Okay, so for step 4, we're going to brainstorm a list of what we can do each day to strengthen that dimension of self. So again, we're going to get conceptual again. We're going to think about tangible, concrete things that we can do that's going to strengthen this muscle, this new trait that we're really working to embody. So just let yourself get a little bit in the conceptual mind and think about what's 1 or 2 or even 3 things that you can do each day to begin to strengthen this. And so for this final step, similar to what we did in the 1, 2, 3 shadow, we are going to act as if. So once again, just feel welcome to go into your mind's eye and act as if this quality was already awakened. Even if you had like a magic wand, or if you could visualize yourself really developing this ability, just noticing if you can open up some latency, some latent potential within yourself in this moment. And in doing so, this might be a quality that already exists within you, that you're just looking to bring some greater recognition towards. And this might just be a seed that you decided you're planting today, and something that you want to bring greater dedication to in watering and nurturing. And just letting yourself be exactly where you are with developing this inner gold. And knowing that if it exists as a potential, it can be actualized. And if you would like, similar to what we did in the last experiential, if you want to visualize this person in your field of awareness and noticing yourself, just seeing if there's any differences in how you're relating to this person, how they're relating to you, and how you're relating to yourself in this moment. And that draws a close to this activity. So we'll go ahead and come back together. I think we have just 2 minutes left. So I did want to close just by talking again about this idea of individuation, which is something that Carl Jung has really kind of brought into Western psychology. Some different representations of individuation. He called it like this capital S self. It's like this self-organizing principle that exists within us. For him, this was really represented in mandalas. The yin-yang symbol can be another way to represent self. Again, in any type of myth or story or narrative, this idea of the hero, savior, prophet, royalty can exemplify this individuation process, as well as humans who have been immortalized in some form or way. In regards to working with shadow and light, one way to think of it is in terms of like the descent or ascent process. That descent processes involve reclaiming shadow. And today we talked a lot about personal shadow, but there's also the shadow that exists in the collective. So a collective form of shadow, again, that can be really typified with scapegoating groups. And so for some of us, you might feel called to do this type of descent work, to continuously integrate personal and collective shadow. And again, just as we're doing descent practices, doing some form of ascent practice, where we're also recognizing these more uplifting, transformative qualities of self on the personal and collective level, can be just really powerful practices to engage in. And in closing, I just wanted to invite you all to just reflect on your own beliefs about the nature of self and other, and how those might relate to the purposes of reclaiming shadow and light on a personal and collective level. And just noticing if there's anything that feels personally meaningful for you that you'd like to take away from our presentation. So that draws a close. Again, it's been so great to be with you all today. And yeah, I'll put my, thanks, Peter. I'll put my name in the chat. So if anyone has any questions or would like access to this PowerPoint, just send me an email and I'm more than happy to share it with you and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I see a couple good questions in the chat. We don't have a whole bunch of time, so Doctor so kindly offered the email. Great place to get some of those questions answered. But maybe we have time. I think we have time for just one of these questions. I see one in the chat about asking a little bit more about what giving away my power means. Would you be so kind to tell us just a little bit more about what that could mean?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I'm so glad we have time to answer a question like that. What does giving away my power really mean? Well, I think that's like one of those questions that I can give it to you from my personal lens, but it's one of those questions where I would ask so many people that because it's such a rich inquiry. Giving away power, the way that I think of it is, so as a counselor and as a teacher, I can see it happen pretty clearly when you have someone who is putting their power and their agency on another person to dictate their life in some way, to rescue, to save, to kind of embody these qualities of self in a way to where you don't have to embody them yourself. Like you can just give that person your power. You see that a lot in like hero worship. I think it can happen in Sangha communities where like all this power is like projected onto one figure and they're kind of the holder and the keeper of it. But in doing so, you're not personally empowered in the process. So I think anytime that you're working with someone who does have this, who's a really powerful presence, one indication of it is, am I feeling empowered in presence with this person, or is this person working to empower me? And because sometimes you can fall into these types of dynamics where, for example, with a counselor or with a teacher, for example, they can kind of assume this larger than life persona. They can really take on that embodiment of kind of being the sage on the stage, of being the hero. And in doing so, it really prevents this person from their own personal empowerment and moving in their own individuation process. So that's just one way that I would answer it. One indication of, am I giving my power away, is, do I feel empowered in the presence of this person? Or am I expecting this person to save or rescue me in some kind of way? Or I think anytime that we're not letting ourselves recognize the mirroring relationship that's happening between self and other, there's probably some aspect that we are giving up some of our power as well. So that'd be my short answer. But again, ask everyone, because I think that's a really good question.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Dr.
thanks,
Cigrand.
Peter.
So